This is a painting created by Adolf Hitler. It is widely considered to be his most disturbing piece of work. It is an untitled oil painting that was likely created between the years of 1910 and 1913, a formative time in Hitler's life that was draped in turmoil, anger, bitterness, and hopelessness. He rarely put any of these emotions on a canvas. He hid his true feelings behind nice architecture, pretty skylines, and colorful sceneries. But inside was a man who was gradually obtaining a darker mindset, who was becoming overwhelmed by his anger. This mindset was the beginning of a chain reaction that would change the course of history forever, and yet he never expressed this through his art. His work has been described as a lot of things, and has been critiqued for various different reasons. They've been called rigid, derivative, unoriginal, and lacking any kind of real substance or flavor, but mostly they've simply been called boring. But of course you might think people simply make these critiques because they hate Hitler and they don't actually hate his artwork. But in 2002, a modern art critic was asked to review Hitler's art without being told who created the paintings. He ended his review by stating that although the artist was quite good from a technical standpoint, the style in which he drew human figures represented a profound lack of interest in people. A very interesting critique, to say the least. And the fact that he had no idea who he was critiquing cements the idea that Hitler's work struggled to connect with people. Time is the ultimate purveyor of truth, and history has revealed that these paintings were not at all honest. He wrote about his anger, he expressed it in his speeches, but his canvases remained cold, calculated, and still. This may be the one time we saw a moment of honesty in his work. The dark colors, the expressionless men, the endless hallways, it looks like it could be the reception to hell itself. It is an outlier in an otherwise relatively drab collection of work. Now, we're gonna come back to this painting shortly, but in order for you to understand why it stands out so much, we need to also understand Hitler's love-hate relationship with art. He had some complicated feelings about it, and that's putting it lightly. However, once we understand these feelings, we can also start to understand why this painting is significantly different than his other work, and why in a lot of ways it stands out like a sore thumb. A few years before this, in 1907, Hitler had been rejected from the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. A year later, he was rejected for a second time. In between this, his mother died of cancer when she was 47 years of age, and by 1909, he was completely broke. He bounced around homeless shelters, parks, and slept under bridges. Later, he would claim that this was only for a few weeks, but almost all historical data shows that this happened for months. He was still pursuing his artistic dreams, but at this stage, he was creating hand-painted postcards and selling the occasional portrait in an attempt to get by. He was by no means doing well in the world of art, but he still refused to do any kind of labor because of how fixated he was on becoming a successful artist. This was a fruitless endeavor, and when you see how he reacted to the kind of art that was becoming popular at the time, you can start to see a trend. Years later, when Hitler was in power, various different artists started to respond to him through their work. Most notably, Pablo Picasso created Guernica in January of 1937. The piece was a response to the bombing that occurred in Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. The Nazis, along with Mussolini's Italian troops, killed hundreds of people in this attack, with some estimates going as high as 1,600, and they did this on behalf of Spain's fascist leader at the time, General Franco. Picasso's piece achieved global attention, and the money that was made for exhibiting it was given to a Spanish relief fund to help repair damages from the war. One of the people who joined that very same war was a German artist known as Heinz Kowitz. He was a German expressionist who created anti-fascist pieces that often mocked and critiqued Hitler as well as other world leaders. He also created a piece in response to the bombing as well. Him and Picasso were not the only artists to do this. Creators who made surrealist, expressionist, and alternative forms of art were constantly critiquing Hitler, highlighting his crimes, openly mocking him, and turning him into a caricature. It's safe to say that Hitler was not a fan of this, and at the tail end of 1937, the Nazis created an exhibition called the Degenerate Art Exhibition. Hitler himself gave a speech a day before it opened where he declared a merciless war on chatterboxes, dilettantes, and art swindlers. In the actual exhibition, 650 pieces that had been banned from other German museums were showcased in the most unflattering way possible. Picasso's pieces were heavily featured and heavily scrutinized, and the previously mentioned Heinz Kowitz was also featured in the exhibition, and he actually wrote an open letter to Hitler in response to this. At the end of the letter, he said the following: Guernica, concentration camps, and wars against religion. What can German art create in this dance of death of human culture, other than to swing the scourge against the forced march into barbarism? Art always goes against tyranny and with liberty. Death, hate, and deprivation are the negative fundamental values of fascism. But German art grows out of the people, with the people, for the people, and against coercion, amateurish capriciousness, and dictators. The genuine artist only wants to be recognized by a Germany which the greatest German artists long for, a true democratic People's Republic of Germany, because for us that means freedom of thought, creative freedom, and artistic freedom. Soon after this, Kowitz joined the Spanish Civil War, and within a year of penning this letter, he was dead. The exact circumstances behind his death remain uncertain, but he definitely died standing by what he believed in, just like he did with his artwork. It goes without saying that Hitler hated anything that was avant-garde or surreal. He wanted to keep art classic and conventional, and most importantly, he wanted to make sure that anybody who disagreed with him, even in the slightest, was completely and utterly suppressed. He banned them from museums, destroyed their artwork, and sent multiple different artists to prisons or concentration camps where many of them eventually died. All the while, he promoted art that toed the line and propped up Nazi ideals. The passion he once pursued vigorously had turned into a weaponized tool for his own agenda, and now he viciously punished many of the artists who succeeded in a world where he ultimately failed. Despite hating anything that was too far gone in terms of how surreal or alternative they were, Hitler himself still collected artwork that you could describe as quite eerie. This is a painting known as Isle of the Dead by a Swiss painter called Arnold Böcklin, a relatively haunting piece of work. Many people interpret the painting as somebody being brought to the afterlife, and it's hard to look at it and not get a sense of despair or death. It is a lonely and slightly morbid piece of art, and Hitler absolutely loved it. There were multiple versions of it, and the third version of this painting was acquired by Hitler himself, who originally hung it in his holiday home in Germany and then later in his office, proving that it was one of his most cherished pieces. And this wasn't the only time he gravitated towards art that could be considered dark or eerie. One of Hitler's favorite painters and a well-respected artist in the Nazi movement was a man called Caspar David Friedrich, who consistently made paintings that depicted cold and lonely landscapes. When he did paint people, they were almost always alone, looking out into the distance, staring at a view that was just as isolated as they were. And again, this is the kind of work that Hitler was fond of, pieces that were still, cold, isolated, and lonely. When you look at his favorite artists and his favorite paintings, these are the most consistent themes that pop up. So he didn't mind if a painting was eerie, dark, or haunting, and he actually seemed to enjoy it more if it was. But the buck stopped at anything that was too expressionist, surreal, avant-garde, and of course, anything that showcased political views that didn't perfectly align with his own. There was a very fine line between a painting he would praise and hang on his wall, and a painting he would destroy entirely for being a so-called degenerate piece of work. And that brings us right back here. The darkest painting Hitler himself ever made. I wonder what the dictator would have thought about the artist, specifically this painting. Would this have been too dark for his liking, or would it have been just about acceptable like some of the other art in his collection? I guess we'll never know. What we do know is that he never talked about this painting. In interviews and conversations, he occasionally talked about his artistic pursuits and would make reference to specific pieces from time to time, and this one never got a mention. Of course, that could be because it wasn't noteworthy enough for him. Maybe he simply had little to no pride in his work when it came to this painting, but as the years have gone on, it has become one of his most talked about pieces, and in 2017, it was actually put on display in a museum in Italy. Soon after this, a man attempted to stab the painting with a screwdriver, but ultimately failed. The curator of the museum, Vittorio Sagarbi, defended the inclusion of the painting in the exhibition, but also critiqued the piece by saying the following: "It is a painting by a desperate man. You do not see greatness here, you only see misery. It is not the work of a dictator, but that of a wretch. It reveals a profoundly melancholic soul." And that is essentially how you could describe most of Hitler's work. A collection of paintings by a desperate man. Ultimately, his biggest contribution to the world of art was weaponizing it, censoring it, and destroying it. He was never accepted in that world, and instead of facing that reality, he tried to burn it to the ground. Some of the artists he targeted were exiled, some were killed, and some were never heard from again, but you can still say that Hitler failed in his mission question, because if he had his way, that style of expressionist alternative art would have completely faded into the shadows, but instead it lives on. Some of those styles are bigger today than they've ever been, a fact I'm sure Hitler would absolutely loathe. In the end, they were able to do what he wasn't, express themselves in their art. We have to read facts and figures and watch documentaries to learn about this man, because his paintings tell us nothing. His anger, bitterness, and dark thoughts bled well outside of the canvas as his real thoughts and feelings came to light, and his paintings began to age terribly because of this, a collection of work that might as well be a mask. In an alternative timeline, he was able to express himself through his art, launch a successful career as a painter, and the world as we know it could be completely different. But we are not in that timeline. We are in this one. And instead of a career full of honest paintings that accurately reflected the artist's mindset, we were given one rare moment of honesty, and it simply wasn't enough.